Good evening. I'm Aki Nakanishi, Art Unit's Curator of Culture, Art, and Education here at Portland Japanese Garden. And I'm extremely honored to be the host of this evening. And even before I begin the pre-opening rituals to kind of set the tone for the entire evening, I'd just like to say from the very outset that this evening really is made possible by our garden supporters across the city of Portland, and of course beyond. Without you, undoubtedly, none of this, including the very exhibition that I'm going to talk about later, would have been possible. So thank you so much. And I'd like to also especially thank those generous individuals, including Joe and Didi Yeager, Cheryl Atchison, Kei Kitagawa and Andrew Johnson Laird, and of course, Kao and Meiho Tanabe. Thank you so very much for putting your faith in us. And for all of you generously tuning in this evening, we humbly hope this finds you and all your loved ones very well and in high spirits during these extremely unsettling times. We are just gonna wait for a few more minutes just to make sure everyone is settled in front of their PCs with a nice cup of tea or something, anything that's going to go nicely with what's going to be an invigorating discussion this evening. We are very fortunate to be joined by over 180 people this evening, so that's why we just need to kind of wait around for a couple of minutes. But I guess while I've got the attention of some of you who just joined us all prepared, I know a number of you are actually joining us from Japan and Europe, so just so brilliant to have such a well-rounded representations of so many cultural organizations ranging from government agencies from multiple countries actually, museums, private foundations, business and academia. I just like to take a few moments to provide a sort of preemptive answers to some of the most commonly asked questions. One question that I get asked a lot is, what do you do at the garden with that kind of a long title of yours? The short answer here is that my job really is to observe, plan, and develop programs along with a fantastic team of Japanese gardeners headed by Sada Uchiyama and Hugo Torrey to ensure seamless integration of all the three domains. That's culture, art, and of course education, with a view to offering garden visitors a holistic cultural experience, both online and offline, that deeply relates to Japan's aesthetic philosophies in landscape, architecture, and the art with a big capital A, of course. With this, I'm just gonna gradually dive into the main part of the discussion this evening by again welcoming all of you to the program. And for those of you who just joined the program, I'm Aki Nakanishi, Art Unit's Curator of Culture, Arts, and Education. I'm just so incredibly humbled to host this evening's discussion, inviting some of the most astute and revered leaders, thinkers, and activists from the Japanese American community. Before bringing in the distinguished speakers, though, I must begin by letting you know that this is the first of a three-part panel discussion that's associated with the main art exhibition. It's called Healing Nature. This is currently taking place at the Garden. This Healing Nature explores the gardens and art of Manzanar, which was one of the 10 American concentration camps that incarcerated approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were actually American citizens by birth. Let's have a quick preview of the exhibition here, so you know what I'm talking about here as well. The exhibition, as you'll see, is a photography exhibition. It's a group show by three renowned photographers of the 20th century. You probably know one or all of them, namely Ansel Adams, Dorothea Lane, and Toyo Miyatake. this is put together really to reveal the resilience, perseverance, and resourcefulness of Japanese American internees at Manzanar and other camps. We, Portland Japanese Garden, decided to organize this exhibition chiefly because this year marks the 75th anniversary since the end of World War II. And Portland Japanese Garden had dedicated this year to global peace, going back to our very core values and founding principles about 60 years ago, where a group of civic leaders here in Portland, Oregon, came together and decided to build authentic Japanese gardens to promote genuine mutual understanding through shared appreciation of nature and culture. It was also very important for us all this year to honor and pay respects to the legacies and memories of what the Japanese American community has had to endure and has experienced since the turn of the last century, especially during wartime. And just as we ventured out to see what exhibition we can create from scratch that really addresses the kind of unique point of reference in this chapter of the Japanese American history, we happened to stumble upon the fact that at one point, there were more than 100 Japanese gardens created by the internees at Manzanar in the Owens Valley of California. And multiple studies have actually suggested that all of the 10 camps, of course, all of them built in desolate grounds, had gardens of some sort built by the imprisoned communities. Perhaps one of the most famous Japanese gardens is the one photographed here by Ansel Adams. There were other critical impetus that really drove our determination to do this exhibition this year, including the monumental exhibition put together some years ago. I think it was 2010 at the Smithsonian Institute by Delphine Hirasuna, called The Art of Command, that traveled across the United States and Japan, exploring the amazing wealth of camp crafts created by thousands and thousands of Japanese American internees using found objects and repurposed sort of everyday objects that they could find in the vicinity to add beauty and perhaps a sense of pride to what it was that they must have been going through. So beyond the kind of artistic examination of the three renowned photographers there was a fundamental question that we were asking ourselves. That was, why do people create gardens, even beyond simple subsistence and beautification? So looking at these photo images and photography, you can see how the garden also served as a kind of source for numerous creative practices, like drawing, poetry making, botanical printing, the traditional Japanese art of flower arrangements, and countless other landscaping activities. So while it is a powerful illustration of what happens when mass hysteria and racial bigotry really takes over our core values, this exhibition really is about what we call cultural landscape, through which to ponder human relationships with nature and community as a kind of source of cultural identity and dignity, as well as source of solace and, of course, serenity. So I hope some of you can actually come visit the garden and show the exhibition for yourselves before it closes on January 31st next year. Last but not least, I must also point out that the exhibition is dedicated to the late Irene Hirano Inoue, a visionary leader of US-Japan relations, who probably needs no introductions actually, a champion of Japanese Americans, who were truly instrumental in the establishment of the establishment of the Japanese American National Museum, with its new headquarters back then in 1992, and later recognized as the spearheading figure for the founding of the US-Japan Council, with a mission of bridging the US closer with Japan on all levels and spheres of interchange. Well, with this, I'd like to start introducing all of the distinguished speakers of the evening to get the ball rolling. First, having spent her formative years in both Japan and the United States, she has long been involved heavily in the arts as well as social justice movements of the 60s and 70s across different parts of the United States for not just Japanese Americans, but also for other ethnic minority groups. Recognized in Oregon and beyond as one of the influential advocates for underserved communities, her leadership has truly provided guidance in the establishment of Oregon Nikkei Legacies Center, now known as Japanese American Museum of Oregon, serving as its first executive director since 1998. Of course, our friend now, Lin Fuchigami, serves as the current executive director there. June was also a longtime co-chair of Asian Pacific Networks of Oregon. June, it's a brilliant pleasure to have you here tonight. Second, we have a globally acclaimed political scientist of our time, specialized in the fields of the US-Japan bilateral, as well as multilateral relationships, involving geopolitics, economics, and of course, technological innovation policies. And he's someone who I dearly adore and respect, who leverages all that amazing wealth of global networks to deepen the business, policy, as well as cultural ties between the two countries through the Silicon Valley Japan platform, which he now co-chairs. Dr. Okimoto, or Dan, it's a true honor to have you here this evening. And of course, last but not least, we have one of the most celebrated Japanese American filmmakers and social activists who wears many, many different hats as advocate, scholar, filmmaker, educator, cultural connector, and of course, chief curator of the National Museum down in Los Angeles, whose leadership and vision has inspired and touched countless other Japanese American leaders, as well as Asian and non-Asian social justice advocates literally across the board. We are truly blessed to have you here tonight to participate in this evening, Karen. Thank you so much.
Nice to be here.
For the first section of the program, Dan, I'd like to get this program rolling by asking you to kind of do a brief presentation on your own journey as someone who was born in one of the relocation centers into immigrant parents and has really had to grapple with your cultural heritage while being sometimes, in some cases, more American than some of the other American colleagues of yours, perhaps. I know this is not a political science or tech innovation discussion tonight, so I don't know how comfortable you're feeling right now, but Dan, if I could ask you to kind of set the tone for the rest of the conversation tonight with your presentation, that would be terrific.
Thank you very much, Aki. It is an honor to be a participant in this evening's panel discussion and in the program that the Portland Japanese Garden has organized. The one relationship in my life which has been the most important is one over which I had no input or voice, and that was my parents, the choice of my parents. It was really the hand of fate that made me the son of my parents, and it's, oops. My screen is not working properly. I don't know why. Let me go back to try to fix this. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. So my parents are the two shown before you. My mother, Kirie Kumagai, born in a farming family in Fukuoka, Japan, became a school teacher, and then became a Christian, married my father, whom she met at the theological seminary. My father, Tamechi Okimoto, was born in Iwakuni, Japan, part of Yamaguchi Prefecture, right next to Hiroshima. And the two of them obviously had a profound impact on my life. I feel that destiny has treated me kindly to have had these two parents. My mother was a very kind and warm and loving person, an educator. My father was a more brooding individual who had a difficult childhood and had a terrible temper. So I was always a little bit intimidated by him. He had a powerful presence when he was in the room, and it scared me a bit. Very hardworking, extremely skilled at whatever he did, and he could do almost anything: repair the house, build a garden, cook, do calligraphy, bonsai, art, whatever. He was a Renaissance man and a perfectionist, somebody that always demanded a high standard of performance. So I always felt imperfect and lazy around him because of the high standards that he set. But these two parents, into which I was born, and my siblings, three older siblings, two older brothers and an older sister, we were swept up in the Japanese-American internment process. And so for the first 3 years of my life, we were deeply affected by what happened with the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, followed the next day by the Congress declaration of war and an isolationist America immediately coming into war. And 2 months later, on February 19th, with the US government's issuing of the Executive Order 9066, which organized the internment of all Japanese living along the West Coast, about 120 of us. So this was really the low point in US-Japan relations. And the Pacific War, the fiercest war that Japan and the United States have ever faced, with casualties, deaths of over 2 million people. This was the reason that we were interned in Arizona. Our families were given very short notice to pack up our belongings, things that only could be carried. And my mother and siblings, I was in my mother's womb at the time, rode one of these trucks from San Diego to Santa Anita. And in August, I was born at Santa Anita racetrack. It's ironic that I was born in a racetrack because my parents were very much against gambling. And they were, but this was the year of the horse, and it's somewhat appropriate that in the year of the horse, I was born in Santa Anita racetrack. My father carved out of wood in Hebrew a verse from the Bible saying, "God is with us." They were very devout Christians, and they felt that God would take care of us. And on the back of this wooden plaque, he sketched from an aerial perspective, the whole layout of Santa Anita racetrack and all of the barracks that were built to house the Japanese Americans and the Japanese who were brought there. So at the tender age of 2 weeks, my family and I were put into these trains and taken from Santa Anita to, we didn't know where, but we wound up in Poston, Arizona, a very long trip where basically the temperature was over 120 degrees inside, and my parents tell me I nearly died of heat prostration. And you see here, Poston was one of 10 internment camps, the largest of the 10 with 20,000 people. And it was like all the other camps, based in deserted outposts, the Badlands, really unsuited for human habitation. And what I remember most from the camps are these sandstorms that suddenly erupted and swept through camps. But our neighbors were poisonous reptiles and poisonous insects. And it was an extremely difficult place to live. And that was the place we lived for 3 years. Political prisoners in the land of American democracy. And I think I was among the youngest in Poston internment camp. My parents called me Daniel because of the parable of Daniel in the lion's den, who the king thought was going to be eaten up by the hungry lions, but God protected Daniel. And so that's why they named me Daniel from the Old Testament Bible. This is a picture of my parents and me in Poston. It was, and my siblings, oldest brother Paul, my older sister Ruth, and older brother Joe. So we lived for 3 years in Poston in a situation in which we were surrounded. Our lives, our universe were defined by Issei and the Nisei who lived there with us. It's hard to tell exactly what impact this had on me, but in psychology, it's said that your brain architecture and cerebral circuitry are all formed in the first 3 years of your life. So I'm sure that this had a profound effect. Being surrounded by Issei and Nisei and seeing only Japanese Americans had a huge impact on my sense of self, a sense of trust and community. And I have felt then and since then, especially, a profound closeness to Issei and Nisei, to the Japanese American community. I admire tremendously what they were, what they are, what they stood for. And in my life, I've had a chance to interact with many brilliant academics, Nobel Prize winners, pioneers in Silicon Valley, billionaires, heads of state. But the people I admire most are the Issei, not hugely educated, but hardworking, dedicated to their families, resilient, and tough. And these Nisei who volunteered to serve in the US military when their parents and families were locked up and deprived of their human rights. And yet they went and fought bravely and earned 18,000 medals, the most decorated unit in American military history unto that point. So this experience of spending the first 3 years of my life in the internment camp was truly seminal. But for the first 18 years of my life, I had a profound sense of ambivalence about Japan and Japanese history, Japanese culture. It was Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, first of all, that was the proximate cause of our being rounded up and placed into internment camps. Of course, that was the American government that did that, but nonetheless, it was the Pacific War that was the catalyst. And the treatment of prisoners in Japanese war camps was said to be cruel. There was a lot of propaganda spread, racist stereotypes, kamikaze pilots, the kind of level of fanaticism that seemed to characterize Japanese soldiers. So I had this great ambivalence about being Japanese in the United States. But at the same time, I had a great deal of ambivalence about the United States as well. And of course, there were the atomic bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And still to this day, I am troubled by the decision to drop those bombs. And equally as troublesome were the fire bombings of Japanese cities, where innocent, elderly, infirmed women, mothers, and children died, anywhere from 300,000 up to 1 million. We don't know what the exact count is. But those were events that troubled me greatly. And of course, the difficulties of the minorities in the United States were troubling. So I didn't feel either fully American or fully Japanese, certainly not fully Japanese. So I wrote a book called American in Disguise, which captured my sense of really not being recognized as an American, not being recognized or comfortable as a Japanese. And during the 1940s and 1950s, Japan seemed like a pretty remote country, a country that had gone through the devastation of war, a third world country in terms of having to rebuild. I remember Japanese toys that were in the 1940s and 50s, cheap, badly made, broke easily. And even though we were a very poor family, I remember putting packages together of Spam and chicken noodle soup and other delicacies and sending them to our relatives in Japan. We exported high cholesterol and sodium, I think, to our families, but it kept them, helped to keep them fed. And my father, he was probably the biggest influence on my life. As I said, a man that was complex, had a temper, was very demanding, but an extremely capable individual. And it was through him that I was connected to Japanese culture and came to admire Japanese culture. Calligraphy. He was superb at art and calligraphy. Gardens, cactus gardens, learning about cactus in Poston, Arizona. And he loved to make cactus pots and gardens afterwards. Bonsai, he was superb at creating bonsai and grafting trees and creating gardens and so forth. He was really a survivor. He could do almost anything with his hands. So I went to college on the East Coast with really ambivalent feelings about Japan and the United States. And in college, my freshman advisor, who was a Middle Eastern literature specialist, who had just been to Japan on an enchanting summer trip, insisted that I study Japanese, which was being offered at Princeton for the first time. And I took Japanese classes in literature. These were English translations of Japanese literature, but I studied the Manyoshu, a collection of marvelous poems from the 8th century of Japan, and the Tale of Genji, maybe the first great novel in the world of the 11th century. And I was struck by the fact that, I had been so moved by the Canterbury Tales that was written in the late 14th century, like 3 centuries after the Tale of Genji, and Shakespeare in the 16th and 17th centuries, several hundred years after the Tale of Genji. And I went to Japan in 1962, 1963 as an exchange student, and I was exposed to Japanese cuisine, which was exquisite. I had soul food Japanese in the US, none in camp, but I was introduced to unagi, eel, shabu-shabu, and all sorts of other delights, including Japanese curry rice, which is not so refined, but something that I really came to enjoy. I like the fermented food of Japan, including tsukemono, probably, and miso, my 2 favorite Japanese dishes. And I was exposed to Japanese film. This was the heyday of Kurosawa, of Ozu, and many others. And seeing these Japanese films had a profound impact on me. Again, the impact of aesthetics. The woodblock prints of Hokusai here. Munekata, one of the great folk artists, folk craft artists in Japan. Mashiko yaki, the pottery of Mashiko, which I loved, Hamada pottery in particular. And my visit to the Katsura Rikyu, the imperial villa in Kyoto in the summer of 1963, that's the event that changed my life, that made me a convert forever to Japanese culture. I was really moved by the beauty of nature and human architecture and design. This is, to me, the essence of Japanese culture, the essence of Japanese design, and it made a profound impact on me. And then, of course, right afterwards, we had in the United States and throughout the world, Japanese products, consumer products that became world-class, including automobiles and consumer electronics and watches. So for my first job, I came to Stanford in 1975. And this was a time when Silicon Valley was emerging as a major force. And I became quite fascinated by the competition between the United States and Japan in semiconductors, because semiconductors was really the major technology in the 1970s and 1980s. And there was a tremendous competition between big Japanese giants like NEC and Sharp and Sony against a lot of very small but dynamic American companies. And in that competition, Silicon Valley won, hands down. And companies like Toshiba, Sanyo, Olympus, and Sharp faced in the 21st century bankruptcy. And today you see that the high-tech companies, the digital technology companies of the United States are the richest in the world in terms of their capital value. Apple, over $1.5 trillion, Microsoft, Amazon, Alphabet or Google, and Facebook. There is no Japanese company in this group. So I was worried that Japan would fall behind the United States, Europe, China, and Asia by not really catching up with digital technology. So we organized the SVJP, a group of us, and we invited Prime Minister Abe to come to Silicon Valley. Prime Minister Abe came in 2015 as the first Japanese head of state to visit Silicon Valley. And his visit had a profound impact, both on Silicon Valley and on Japan. And we had a series of very important discussions. So our organization, the SVJP, became very active in seeking to bridge, deepen, and expand the interactions between Silicon Valley and Japan, and to help Japanese companies really get down the learning curve on digital technology. My wife, Michiko, has been a co-founder and a close colleague of mine, my best colleague in this endeavor, and she has really infused the organization with her warm touch. We've had, like last year, over 1,500 guests come to our house and feel a sense of omotenashi, which she conveys. And so Japan has emerged as a very important world actor. And I do believe that the Cold War ended in part because of the success of Japan in East Asia and the success of the European allies in Europe. The US, by contrast, I think has been in a slow and recently rapid decline. And we see this in the number of COVID deaths per million residents. The US has had a horrendous time dealing with the COVID contagion and the deaths, even though we have the most advanced medical infrastructure. And over the past 40 years, our economy has become so unequal that I think it would be difficult to sustain this economy in the face of various difficulties that the US is likely to confront in the 21st century. Inequality has soared, and the three richest people in the United States have assets that are equal to about 40% of the American population. And over the past 40 years, the United States has seen $50 trillion move from workers into the hands of the top 1% of the population. That is an unsustainable level of inequality that will make it difficult for the United States to maintain stability and democracy in the US. And our president, I never thought I would live to see the day that we would have a president who lied constantly and whose way of conveying messages was to repeat lies in such a way that they seem like truths. So we now have an America which is deeply divided, deeply politically polarized, and a fragile democracy. And we see how much leadership matters. And one of the troubling things for me individually was to see the close relationship between Prime Minister Abe and President Trump. Yes, it's critical that America and Japan get along, but the level doesn't need to be like this. And America and Japan can have a strong, stable relationship, even if there's conflict between the two heads of state, as we've seen in the example of Germany, Angela Merkel and Donald Trump. What troubled me is that the Japanese didn't seem to realize what a pernicious political pathogen Donald Trump was for the United States democracy. And so my hope is that Japan will play an increasingly constructive role in the world. For example, in the area of climate change, Prime Minister Suga has declared that Japan will be carbon neutral by the year 2050. Be an extraordinary achievement and contribution to our collective good. And Japan, as an aging and shrinking society, is nonetheless a prosperous and comfortable, safe society. I admire what they have been able to maintain in terms of equity and equality in their political economy. And I come back to my parents because really my involvement in US-Japan relations in Japan is owed to the fact that I'm a child of Tameichi and Kirie Okimoto. I never expressed my gratitude to them for the sacrifices that they made on our behalf. I've always regretted that. And they died when I was, my mother died when I was 13 and my father died when I was 27. So the way that I try to express my gratitude is to plunge myself, double down on work for US-Japan relations. My siblings have not been as involved in US-Japan relations as I have, but they have been deeply involved in their own worlds of business and art and medicine. And I have relied upon them for support and guidance always. And my own children, my family has been the most gratifying experience of my life. My daughter here, Saya, and her husband, Paul, and my son, Kevin, and his wife, Mary. And my daughter and her two kids now, Mari and Liam, 16 and 15, and her husband, Paul, and my son, Kevin, and his wife, Mary, and three grandchildren, Lilia, McKenna, and Kai. So for me, I don't know whether my grandchildren will gravitate to US-Japan relations like I have. I doubt it, but I hope that they will be exposed to it and benefit in many ways that I have in the US-Japan relationship. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh my God. I hope I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant. What can I say? Well, thank you so much, Dan, for sharing with us the cross-section of your absolutely amazing life journey. Beautiful family as well, and your professional views on world politics as well as the socio-economic kind of landscape all over, not just within Japan and the United States, but touching on such many areas of importance, you know, and that are also very relevant to what it is that we're going to be discussing today. Illustrating also how you have come to kind of let the dual cultural heritage coexist in a very symbiotic way within yourself. And that's certainly a lot to definitely unpack here, and more than enough to get the conversation rolling for sure. No, if I can just take a step back here to firstly sort of point to the legal paradigm of the time back then, around 1942, 1945, regarding sort of immigrations and naturalization. And this is kind of where I'd like to start bringing in other panel members, beginning with you, Karen, if I may. While I was still doing research for this exhibition that I was talking about earlier, Manzanar, Healing Nature, as complex and multi-dimensional as it is, our team of docents and an entire exhibition team basically sat through an orientation program graciously put together by Director of Education at your museum, an absolutely delightful person to work with, Lin Yamasaki, to go through some of the essential facts in the legal landscape, including the Executive Order 9066 that Dan alluded to, touched upon earlier, was signed by FDR that legally enabled this forceful removal of American citizens to take place. The Immigration Act of 1924 that targeted not just Japanese nationals, but Asian immigrants at large, who could not legally even apply for the naturalization process in this country until fairly recently. And the very terminology and euphemisms that we needed to be made aware of going into these really complex issues. So I guess my question to you, Karen, is that it's just what were some of the fundamental wrongs there that you have sought to make right through your body of work as a social activist and researcher, and how the kind of drive for change emerged in you. If you can sort of let us into a bit of your personal journey, if you like, against the backdrop of what had been done to the Japanese American community at large during those really, really turbulent times. That would be really appreciated.
Well, thank you, Aki, and thank you again for having me. Dan, that was really amazing. You touched on such important points that we all should really ponder. I was born, I'm a Sansei, the third generation Japanese American. So I was born after the war. So, but although I was not physically in camp, I really felt that I inherited camp. And that was felt in a couple of primary ways. Personally, as many Nisei didn't talk about camp very much, growing up. But my mother always said that I had to do well, get good grades, not get into trouble. And, it was not so much to uphold the family name, but as she said, it was to prove that it was wrong to put us into camp. So this mandate was really emphatic from her, and I could tell that it was deeply emotional. So that after I learned about the mass incarceration, I realized that this was her only recourse to righting a grave wrong. It was a personal insult that she felt because she always considered herself an American. As Dan had mentioned, she was born here, and actually she had never been to Japan even until she was in her 40s, I don't think. And then, secondly, I think, as an American myself, or more appropriately, one who believes in democracy and human and civil rights, I knew that if democracy in this country was so fragile that it could not protect its citizens and residents, that we were everyone was subjected to that frailty, no matter what their skin color, background, et cetera. That, if the Constitution failed one group, it could just as easily fail anyone. So, that was really why I started my own journey, learning more about the incarceration, learning more about Japanese America, You know, and then even now, how with the migrant detention that we have in this country at this point, how, you know, as a Japanese American whose people were also subject to unconstitutional and racist-based judgment, that we really need to speak up. You know, we really need to be the allies that we didn't have at the time. So, you know, our history is not just in the past. You know, it really is very relevant to the future as well.
Well, thank you so much, Karen. That's just a powerful story and beautiful rundown of a vast framework that probably continues to drive what it is that you do at the museum and beyond those boundaries. If I can turn to you, June, by asking you to first unmute yourself. Yeah. You bring yet another very unique perspective to the table here. As you were raised in both countries, having spent some of your formative years in Japan, then returning to the US after the war. How do you think growing up in those extremely turbulent times impacted your personal journey for both cultural identity and a sort of sense of social justice? If you can sort of put your kind of life work and also since the time you returned to the United States, you know, into perspective for us, that would be appreciated.
Well, I am also a Sansei generationally, the Sansei meaning third generation. And I say that because my mother is a Nisei born in Seattle, Washington. So that would make me Sansei. But I was born in Japan with a father who was a Japanese national. So when I came to the United States, I came as an immigrant at age 11. How I became an activist or my involvement in the issues relating to the Japanese American and in American civil rights movement has to do, I think, with my needing to integrate my Japanese upbringing during World War II and the years after the war, experiencing pretty basic things. You know, when you're a little kid, you don't analyze philosophically, but what you remember is things like hunger, scarcity, and insecurity as to what's going to happen next. So those are real experiences that I came with in my early years. And then I, as an immigrant, I needed to find my place in the new country, learning a new language, new schools, all of those things. And so the need to find my footing really was the base for my search for identity, how I fit into the social issues of the times that I was growing up in the United States. I was, in some ways, I can relate to the Issei generation in that I can understand their frugality as a very strong part of their life because of my early childhood. And so when I later became involved as a volunteer in Japanese American issues and projects, I felt very comfortable, even though I technically am an immigrant. I felt very much in tune with people who were here before me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, June. So back to you, Dan, sort of being guided through your presentation, also at the same time, if I could ask you to unmute yourself, sort of being guided through your presentation earlier, couldn't help but to wonder if you had a lot of sort of negative emotions and resentment towards Japan, even though you presumably had a natural affinity to the country and I guess its culture. And I think you briefly touched on the sort of tipping point where, I guess, in your life where those negative feelings became somewhat softened and made you want to become more of a bridge between the two cultures. Can you elaborate a bit more on that kind of psychological, perhaps a physical process where, as to why it was important for you to pursue that path you've taken?
I've always had a fascination with Japan, even though, as I said, until I went to college, I had pretty ambivalent feelings about Japan. But, you know, my interactions with Issei and older Nisei, my parents' friends, you know, I had a deep personal attraction, affinity for Japan and the Japanese. And when I got to college, I was able to study Japan. Before college, I never had a single textbook or book or class that discussed Japan, Japanese history. It was all Western Europe and the United States. So when I went to college, I became fascinated in learning more about the history of Japan, its society, its culture, its literature, and its aesthetics. And then once I spent a year in Japan, that was really what changed it completely. I became certain that this was what I wanted to concentrate on. And my advisor at that time was George Kennan, a distinguished American diplomat, a Soviet specialist, who told me that the best way for you to prepare for a career, if you want to be a diplomat or academic or whatever, is to concentrate on studying one country in depth. And he did that with the Soviet Union and Russia. And I did that and went to graduate school instead of law school or business school. I decided to go pursue a PhD and start studying Japan. And I realized when I started that I would never be able to deeply understand everything about Japan. I mean, I could try to learn as much as possible, but it would be a lifelong mission. And I'm still discovering things about Japan that are fascinating and so encouraging. So Japan's own transformation from a devastated, war-torn country, from a military power to a peace-loving country and an economic powerhouse, an aging society, again, is one of the most fascinating stories of a nation state in world history. I can't think of another example of a military power which, after defeat, completely renounces military power, as Japan has renounced. And I can't think of a state that really has transformed itself, its economy, in the way that Japan has. And so there is a kind of switching of roles. I mean, I had always admired the US as a colossus in the world system, built the post-war structure after liberal democratic values, and admired, you know, what compared to other colonial powers, what America had tried to do in the international system. But I see really today, after 40 years of of economic inequality, the problems that America faces in the world as a declining hegemon. And I think that the US and Japan have only barely scratched the surface of collaboration and synergy that they can generate for the betterment of both countries and the world. So that's that's what excites me now, to think about areas like climate change or healthcare or disaster preparation, disaster relief, where the two countries can really work together in a way that will benefit mankind.
Right. So there's a kind of global framework where US-Japan bilateral relationship could kind of further the global interest for the betterment of the humanity, kind of really big scale stuff. And also there's a talk about sort of Japanese-American community-based perspective within this country in the United States. And I want to sort of take another step back here to really kind of start focusing on the not just Japanese American community here, but Japanese American community as part of larger Asian community. As June talked about some of her kind of seminal experiences during the civil rights movements of the 60s. I guess chiefly that was constructed by the African American population at large. That has some correlation probably with the anti-war movements against, this time, Vietnam War. Collectively, probably they had tremendous impact on how the Japanese Americans, most notably Nisei's and Sansei generations, how they came together really to establish voice for the marginalized ethnic groups, not just for Japanese Americans, but all of the marginalized ethnic groups. So I want to turn the attention to Karen this time. You, as an author, wrote a critically revered book on Asian American movement called Serve the People, Making Asian American in the Long 60s. That was some years ago, but I wonder if you can briefly walk us through some of the important moments in the collective consciousness of the Japanese Americans to kind of think wider and deeper about ethnic representations in society, by perhaps coming together with the other Asian American groups beyond the sort of those strictly defined ethnic lines, Chinese or Japanese or Filipinos for that matter.
Yeah, you know, until the Asian American movement of the late 60s, early 70s, there were no Asian Americans. You know, we were Japanese American, Chinese American, Filipino American. Those were the largest Asian ethnic or communities in the country at that time. So, you know, by 1970, you know, 80% of Japanese in this country and 50% of Chinese and Filipinos were born here. We were Americans. And yet we were not seen, you know, as such. So, you know, as you mentioned, Aki, it really was the Vietnam War that was really a large catalyst, a racist war against people who looked like us. The first war that was televised. So we were really pushed, you know, in terms of a push-pull theory of change. You know, we were pushed by the Vietnam War, but we were also pulled by what else was happening during that time of the liberation movements that were happening all over the world. So we were pulled really by a promise and the thought of a third world, where we realized that people of color, we are a third world and we're not a minority. We're actually a majority from a global perspective. So, you know, it was at that time that we came together to form and create a home that we never had. And we called it Asian America. So, you know, one of the pioneers in Asian American studies had said that the Asian American movement was the turning point in our history. in this country, of Asian Americans in this country. So my book, is really part of an ongoing effort to unravel, how Asian Americans how Asian America came into existence. And then once created, how this political identity really created a consciousness as both Pan-Asian, but also as people of color. And there was a solidarity there and an identification as third world, as people of color. So, the book, really, it doesn't intend to say that the Asian American movement of the 70s, 60s still exists. It really does not, and nor should it. I think young Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders now are much more comfortable in their yellow-brown skins than we ever were. But it really was understanding how the political project of Asian America came into being without a desire to resurrect it, but rather to build upon it.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that immaculate mentor to all the movements to put things in a much better context here as well. June, if I can again ask you to unmute yourself, I would definitely feel remiss if I didn't ask you about Minoru Yasui, a legendary American lawyer who was criminally convicted for standing up against the infringement of the constitutional rights right when it was happening during war. But of course kept marching on, and his case was eventually overturned by the United States Supreme Court. I think it was 1986, and subsequently became the only Oregonian to this day, in fact, actually, to have received the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama in 2015, although posthumously. He's someone who reminds me of the famous saying by Winston Churchill, kites rise highest against the wind, not with it. You are a big part of the successful nomination of Minoru Yasui for this highest medal of honor for civilians in the United States. June, can you also tell us a bit about how you became so passionately involved in this kind of movement, also what that meant to the Oregon Nikkei Legacy Center?
Yeah, well, in my early years, in my 20s, I was in Philadelphia and was very much involved in the civil rights movement of the late 60s and 70s. And that's where I learned the issues around racism and discrimination and fight for civil rights. But at that time, discussion was about Black and white. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 is one of those legislative challenges that acknowledges the racist policies of World War II against Japanese Americans. And that fighting spirit and the persistence that Min Yasui carried throughout his life in achieving that legislation is what motivates many of us and inspires us to take on new challenges. And so after we were successfully able to nominate Min for the 2015 Presidential Medal of Freedom, we got the state legislature to established what is now called Minoru Yasui Day. And it is an official day designated in perpetuity. So annually, we have a event or a program. And the slide you see is the picture from the very first March for Justice on Min Yasui Day, which is on March 28. March 28 is the day of his resistance when he walked the streets of downtown Portland to challenge the curfew law that was imposed in 1942. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 9 months in solitary confinement as a result. And in spite of that, he never gave up his fight for justice, not just for himself, not just for the Japanese Americans, but for all Americans. And so those of us who worked on that medal campaign have formed the Minoru Yasui Legacy Project so that we can continue our work. And so one of the things that we do annually on Min Yasui Day is a conference or symposium. And this year, on March 28, we had planned the flyer conference that has the flyer that you see on the screen, Beyond the Refugee Crisis, Learning from Our Past and Reinventing US Immigration Policy. Well, this is the step we saw that Min would have taken had he been around this year. He's been dead for a number of years, but had he been here, he would have seen the crisis on our southern border as our fight as much as everybody else's. And so we want to make sure that Nikkei in Oregon and all people will join us in finding a forward movement to solving the immigration crisis that we are having. But this event was canceled because of the pandemic. And so this year coming up in 2021, we intend to carry the same theme and present a virtual symposium again, where we're in conversation with Maisie Hirono to be our keynote speaker. And we hope she'll be able to say yes. She indicated some interest, but we just haven't been able to confirm it yet. So this year, because March 28 is a Sunday, we're going to have our conference on March 27, Saturday. It'll be a free event, and we'll be getting the word out sometime in the very near future.
Thank you. Thank you so much, June, for the incredible account of your involvement in such a significant campaign. Dan, I'm getting sort of mindful of our time here. This program to begin the kind of Q&A session shortly. By the way, for those viewers wanting to ask questions to any of the panel members, we are taking in questions using the Q&A box below at the bottom of the screens. The questions will be non-anonymous, and we will ask that that you make questions very succinct and pointed to a specific speaker, just to be mindful of the time to let as many people participate as possible. With that, Dan, as an immigrant from Japan, trying to really take in not just the economic, political, or ideological landscape of this vast country, I myself think that I need to have a deep understanding of the Japanese American journey since the turn of the last century. So it's just been so insightful, actually. I know that you are dealing with a myriad of high-ranking Japanese government or corporate officials cultivating the political and, of course, economic ties with the United States. But kind of looking into the future now, how important do you think it is to kind of broaden the scope of interchange through the cultural understanding, especially among young people, using the platform like the one you have now between Japan and Silicon Valley?
I think that the potential for a deepening of connections between younger Japanese and Americans is enormous. The area of design, for example, is a huge area for talented young artists, architects, engineers, software people, and design. I mean, I think there's no better place to understand the history of design than Japan. So there is a platform. I'm just using design as one example, where there can be a connection between younger generation Americans and Japanese. Of course, there are many other areas of culture, of entertainment, of music and art, and in addition, economics and politics. I personally believe that we're entering into a very difficult period of world history. It's always difficult when the dominant power of an international system is declining sharply. That's the time in which there are world wars. And that's the time in which the conflicts between nation states are very hard to contain. And my feeling is that that's the period that we're heading into. So it's critical, in my view, that US and Japan and Europe, as well as other countries in Asia, work together to promote the common good. I think we're in an era in which private parochial interests trump, I use the word trump, collective welfare, the collective good. And, you know, we used to have political leaders that were willing to risk the longevity of their political careers to do the right thing. That's really, that seems no longer to be the case. And we have so many people pursuing their own personal private gain and not concerned at all of what they should contribute to the public good. And that's an area in which Japan, for its culture, the development of the village culture of Japan, where families worked together, they shared agricultural tools, they worked for the common good. I think that culture is one we can learn a lot from in the West.
Yeah, thank you so much. I couldn't agree with you more there, actually. Karen, now kind of putting you on the spot as the chief curator of Japanese American National Museum. I guess it's charged with the mission of promoting understanding of America's ethnic diversity by sharing the Japanese American experience. Though I guess these days you are doing things mostly online, given everything that's going on. But one of the milestone projects that you've taken on as a curator is perhaps the 1994 exhibition entitled America's Concentration Camps, Remembering the Japanese American Experience, that really set the standard for how we sort of memorialize the camp experience and carry that forward, including how we address those facilities beyond euphemism. And that was a kind of a quarter of a century ago, amazingly. So 25 years on now, given the accelerating kind of convergence of American ethnic groups, as you alluded to earlier, and perhaps the blurring of the traditional ethnic lines these days, would you elaborate a bit more on the future vision and an evolving role of such an ethno-specific cultural institution like yours into the next 75 years?
Yes, thank you. You know, JANM was founded in 1992 with a mission to promote understanding and appreciation of America's ethnic and cultural diversity by sharing the Japanese American experience. But then just a couple of years ago, the board adopted a more refined strategic direction that really sharpened this mission and enhanced its relevance for today's audience. So right now, the emphasis is not so much in passively remembering history as amplifying the lessons of our history in order to combat divisiveness and discrimination, and shape a future that is based on social justice and a vibrant culture of democracy. So, one of the key priorities in fulfilling this mission is developing a new core exhibition, of which I am the lead curator. So the distinguishing factors of this new exhibition will be not only highlighting the lessons, rather than just remembering and commemorating, but also making linkages to similar experiences of other communities, really to explore and provide the Japanese American story as truly an American story that is and has been always intrinsically multiracial and cultural. I want to add to what Dan was saying in terms of the deepening relationship between the U.S. and Japan and Japanese Americans and Japan. So the museum has been doing quite a bit, and like you said, online. We have the Discover Nikkei website that really explores different ways of communicating and relationships on a global perspective as well. So we are working with the Council General of Japan in Los Angeles, on programs such as the history of Japanese corporations and Japanese Americans in Los Angeles. And also we're collaborating with the Nippon Foundation on what is called the Global Nikkei Research Project. And it really talks about, on a global way, what it means to be Nikkei across the globe in 2021. So besides the focus on Japanese Americans here in the United States, we really see that we are fast becoming a global society. And so we need to expand and look at our history in an international and global perspective as well.
That is so intriguing. Thank you so much. Okay, I guess time is probably right for opening the virtual floor up for Q&A. So I would encourage the audience members, virtual audience members, to post questions in the Q&A box below, specifying who the question is for and it's basically addressed to. In the meanwhile, I'm just going to throw an open question to whomever, any one of you, actually, the panel members, would like to raise their hand to comment or answer. And that is, to what degree do you think one could strike the balance between having a coherent voice and identity as part of the Asian American community? Kind of going back to what I was asking Karen earlier. One cohesive voice as Asian American community, balancing that with being a guardian of the Japanese cultural heritage, especially as those core memories and traditions become more and more distant and diluted in an increasingly diverse society. So just a personal opinion would be nice, but any of you interested in answering that question? Nope.
Well, I've already talked a lot, so why don't we go June or Dan?
June, maybe?
Okay, let me give it a try.
Yeah.
I think I think the future of in this country is for communities of color to be building coalitions and partnership to address those issues that we hold in common. And in recent years, we certainly have lots of material to work with. So we have a lot of years of work ahead for us. In order for us to be able to build coalitions or partnerships in these endeavors, each group needs to have a pretty solid grounding in their own histories, personal and community histories. And so we have to help every Asian American group to be, not pretend anymore we're almost white or we're better than the darker people. That kind of attitude still prevails. And so I think it's really important for us to be part of those educational and community development projects that strengthens the individual ethnic communities so that they can better work with each other. And I think we could all be part of that. We need to be more open to building bridges, as your title suggests, in order to move on to the future. As Asian American communities, we're all too small in size, population-wise, to make a big noise. But that's the point of the formation of the Asian American groupings, is to create a little more size and a larger voice. And so, at a practical level, we ought to be looking at, for example, the senatorial rerun. How can we in the West Coast be part of that effort? Because our interest is built into the outcome of that election as much as our own statewide elections. And so we need to, as individuals and as groups, finding ways to be involved in supporting the positive outcome. So that's just one example of how we can't no longer say that's somebody else's problem. It is our problem as well, and we need to accept that.
Thank you so much. A couple of questions just came through, actually. One is for June. So I don't mean to, keep making you sort of speak, but for June, I think you can also see the question down in the Q&A box. This one is from Sylvia. For June, has the emergence of white supremacy and recent hate crimes against groups of all kinds forced you to change your plans for the March 27th conference? If so, how?
Well, I came from a committee meeting at which that planning for the conference was discussed. And one of the points and we are going to proceed with planning for the March 27 event with the topic that we had. One small thinking that, we're just beginning to sort of think more deeply about the consequence of what's going on in our political environment at this point. But we're beginning to think like, what are the security measures we need to build into the virtual conferencing so that we are not hijacked or we are not subjected to hate crime, harassments and things like that. But I think one of the teachings of people like Min Yasui was that we can't be intimidated by every single threat, every single criticism or anything negative. I think we need to build in safety measures and be smart about things, but I think the issue needs to be addressed. And so I think we are planning to proceed.
Right. So the final question, I guess, considering what time it is now, this one is from Yoshio. And this is kind of related to American politics and political landscape here. So I guess Dr. Okimoto, you might be the best one to kind of answer this and tackle this one. How is the current divisiveness in American politics affecting the Japanese American community, and how can Japanese Americans contribute to heal the division?
Well, we have come to a situation in the United States where the divisions are deep and compounded, embedded. So there are cleavages of economic status, for example, cleavages of party affiliation, ideology, religion, gender, and so forth. And the worrisome element of American politics is that they're all combined in a way, including geography, so that we have a deeply divided country where in the rural areas, you have a very strong conservative Republican base. In the suburban areas, you have a very strong Democratic base. And because of the social media, where people are going to get their information from sources that they agree with them, basically, we have embedded pockets of people who don't communicate with the other side. And that's worrisome because, you know, when we get hunkered down into enclaves of people and information, and we look at the other enclaves as our opponents and enemies, it's extremely difficult to reach across the cleavages and work together. And what I fear is that the divisions are so deeply rooted and structural that it's going to be very difficult for any political leader, much less a political party, to heal these divisions. And it goes back, in my view, to the equity in American society. You know, back in the 50s and 60s, when everyone participated in the growth of our economy, not just 1% or 0.001%, there was a sense of optimism about the future and buying in to the collective community of Americans. Today, there is a much more divided sense of opposition. I fear that physical conflict may even come into play at some point in the not too distant future. So the Japanese Americans, Asian Americans, are part of this cleavage, this division, deeply polarized, deeply paralyzed as a political system. But I think we have to find some mechanism. I was hoping that a common threat like COVID would be a unifying mechanism, but instead COVID has become politicized, and even a common threat has been a dividing mechanism in the United States. So I see difficult times ahead for groups in the United States. The division really run very deep, and the only way we're going to get around it is if we begin to communicate with each other and don't regard the other side as deplorable. And so it's going to be a difficult and long-term process.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Dan. There's a kind of a related extended question to the original question posted by someone else, but because of time constraints, we probably will be going back to this person later on with some answers from one of the panelists. But because we are almost coming to the end of the program, I'd like to turn it over to all of the panelists for their final thoughts and comments, maybe 90 seconds each, just to wrap up whatever it is that they've been talking about. Perhaps it's probably fair to start with Karen, since you were, Dan and June had already spoken fairly recently. So to start with you, Karen, if that's okay.
Oh gosh, so much. You know, I think I would really echo what June said, and that we need coalitions. And to get into the divisiveness, you know, we really need the coalitions in order to transcend that. We can no longer be, we can no longer just think of ourselves, because, you know, just at the same as the mass incarceration, if the Constitution didn't protect us, it won't protect anyone. So that, you know, at this point, with all the divisiveness, you know, we need to reach out, and we need to do, you know, a very solid coalition on all fronts.
Thank you so much, Karen. June?
I think one of the important ingredients of a democracy is the educated citizenry. And I think somehow our educational system and our public engagement and ways in which we communicate with each other has failed us to meet the challenges that we have had in the more recent years. And I think part of the solution is that the citizens at the individual level needs to be more involved more than ever before, because it is the individual vote that makes the difference eventually. And the coalition that we talked about before is a way to get us to collective votes that are done in more collective way. So that the power of individual vote can become a powerful voice in this country, rather than individuals acting so separately and not considering the impact that we can have as individuals. So get out the vote is more important now than ever before. I think voter education is important. I am just so astounded with the number of people who voted for my opposition party. And that tells me how vulnerable people are to commercials and lies, and people buy it for whatever reason. And it has to do with one, you know, individual sense of their own worth, and a little more sophistication needed in how we work as groups of people rather than in isolation. So I think we really need to think hard about, at all sectors, how we communicate with each other, how we educate each other, how curious we want people to be, to search for the truth, you know?
Thank you so much for that word of wisdom, June. It means so much to us. Dan, any final thoughts? Oh, you have to unmute yourself, by the way.
As I said earlier, we're headed into a difficult period around the world, a period of deepening division and conflict. There is on the horizon looming a very serious new Cold War between the United States and China. And this Cold War, in my opinion, has the potential to be much more divisive, much more difficult, much more conflict-ridden than the one between the United States and the Soviet Union. China represents a major paradigm threat to the United States, an absolutist state which is using digital technology to monitor and control its citizens, a very efficient, unlike the Soviet Union, very efficient state, one which is galloping to gain supremacy in artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, and many other areas of advanced technology. So a very formidable challenger to the United States, Japan, and the West. And in this effort, there has to be, I think, a greater collaboration between the democratic nations and among Asian Americans, because the racial aspect of the Chinese challenge is susceptible to racist feelings. And I mean, we're calling the virus the China virus, for example, or whatever. And so the divisions among Asian Americans could become substantial. So I think it'll be very important for Asian Americans to hold together as a group and understand one another. And for, in the case of Japan, the Japanese diaspora, Japanese Americans, Japanese Brazilians, to help navigate the international relations involving the US and Asia.
Thank you so much. Well, what can I say? Karen, June, and Dan, I think we touched on so many significant points tonight that will be valuable as we envision the paths forward as members of the increasingly diverse and, like you said, interconnected society. And for me, actually, personally, I constantly find myself in all of the contributions and struggles of those who have come before us, which is a kind of universal thing, I guess, regardless of where you are from, your ethnic group. Just paying respect to those trailblazers and entrepreneurs, like many of your family members, who risked everything to get here and build communities across this country, is something that our garden here in Portland, Oregon continues to do. And, you know, we take pride in doing so. So kind of going back to, just to close this and going back to the exhibition, along with these associated programs like this, really helps us understand that we are all parts of this continuum of constant refining process. Just like when I see gardeners tending to their gardens, as it's a living art form. So there are 2 more associated virtual programs, virtual discussion programs coming up actually from a slightly different angle based on cultural landscape, scheduled on January 20th and 27th. So if you'd like to see more details, info about the panelists and the theme of the discussion, please visit our website. And I would definitely feel remiss if I didn't encourage you to consider supporting our garden or any other partner of ours, US-Japan Council, Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and of course the National Museum. In any way that makes sense for you, actually. And your visitation will be much, much appreciated under these circumstances as well. With that, the biggest gratitude for our distinguished panel members for their generous participation. The amount of time they spent with us was just amazing. The equal thank you to all of you who tuned in to take part in the dialogue on Friday evening or wherever you might be joining us from. So from all of us here in Portland, Oregon, we wish you very warm and happy holidays. thank you very much again, Karen, June, and Dan. Thank you so much for the generous time of yours. I'll see you some other time, okay, in person. Thank you.